Hi, I'm Mark Rosano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. So today we have our econ show, and we're going to focus on some key avenues that we've talked about. We discussed what was going to happen with the Black Sea deal or the Black Sea grain deal. How we were going to get some stress coming from the India's decision to ban the export of non-basmati rice, and now you're actually starting to see some other pressure points coming from Asia. From other parts of Asia, with Vietnam reducing or asking farmers to reduce the amount of water they're consuming, and that's going to adjust the rice flow as well. So we really want to look at food insecurity and how that's rising around the world. And the UN updated one of their reports where it's going to be really important to look at, okay, well, how bad is it around the world? This only goes to 2022, and as we know, in 2023, it has only gotten worse. So we want to take what we know and then extrapolate out. And we're going to talk about how that interlinks with a lot of the pressure points that we're seeing with Niger and other areas of West Africa as we see more stress. Then we're going to look at the service data in the U.S. Service data continues to be positive, but it is slowing. We want to look at what does that stress look like? How is that stress continuing when you look at the market in general within the U.S.? And how really this points to more stagflation. We were expecting things to start to slow down a bit, but we're actually seeing inflation really pick back up. And we want to look at the different levels in which that plays out. Then we're going to flip to the consumer and how all of those pieces really put more pressure on the consumer, where we are in credit card debt. How is that impacting the more recent sales numbers, retail sales numbers, and how is that going to impact things going into really a pivotal back to school season, back to school spending. You always see the pictures of it, all the different pieces when you look into August into September and that beginning of October, and how that really sets up. Then we're going to look at the European consumer data dropped across the board. Again, all the more reason why we see Europe already in a recession and moving deeper into one. We do see their pressure being a bit bigger, and we're going to try to link all that throughout, because inflation is a huge problem, and again, food is a big part of that, as is the increase in oil prices, as Saudi Arabia has extended their their voluntary cut of 1 million barrels into September. And then that rolls us into China. And, China data missed all the estimates. Service was a bit better, but, it's still coming down. By better, I mean, it was better than estimates, while manufacturing continues to slow. But there's this back and forth in terms of what does stimulus look like? What are calls for stimulus? And we really want to go through this once again, because they keep talking about supply side, but realistically, the market there wants demand side, and it really kind of conflicts with that communist view of the whole versus the individual. And we really want to go into that in more detail. So continuing on with that China view, we really wanted to look at that Indo-Pacific issues and where we continue to see a lot of this the struggle point. And this was, I thought, a great infographic looking at what has happened within those regions. We don't see anything happening in the near term when you look at the pressure points between China and Taiwan, but it's a really important piece to look at what has happened. So the geopolitical and military events in the Indo-Pacific region, the China war games, amphibious assault on Taiwan, Taiwan war games, assuming Chinese invasion, U.S. and allies host Olympics of war games, China, Russia, largest joint military exercise, North Korea firing ballistic missiles. So when you look at the ballistic missiles, typically, and I know that everyone loves to give North Korea a lot of clout, a lot of times they're just testing Chinese military equipment, just because it's easier to do it and it's a good way to make sure that they still stay awake. So when you look at some of the different pieces, the Chinese Coast Guard ship joins 30 plus vessels that are swarmed near the Philippines. And remember, we talked about this because there was a big talk in regard to this is very close to oil and gas assets. It's also really close and on top of fish assets. And I think that sometimes we're so focused on oil and gas, and we're so focused on aggression on a military basis, that we forget the most basic thing, which is purely food. And that's one of the things that we've continued to talk about on why the 9-dash line was so important for China. It's not a given, don't get me wrong. It does include oil and gas. It does help try to push the U.S. military further off their coast. But don't sleep on the fact that it includes fish. It includes a lot of fishing zones, which has become a much bigger issue. Then when you look at the Chinese activities through and around Taiwan, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail, it's important to see how these things continue to escalate. And the problem is, as escalations increase, there is a higher probability of an accident or something being misinterpreted, or a ratcheting up that can happen very quickly, which is something that we've seen multiple times, from the Archduke Ferdinand all the way to the Marco Polo Bridge between Japan and China. So again, and those are just two recent examples, but there's obviously all over the place. The U.S. continues to move assets into the region. Obviously, we have the Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group, but we have moved the American Amphibious Ready Group into position, and it continues to stay within this region. And for those that have been following Taiwan and our promises to them, we've said from the beginning that we need 2 weeks to muster. So Taiwan needs to be able to defend itself for 2 weeks. Given our pivot to Asia, which happened under Obama, we've really taken that from a 2-week to a 4-day period. And it's just because of the proximity of assets, the readiness of the assets, and just what we've done and what we've provided with Taiwan. Now, I don't know if you saw, but Biden has now, I think it was $380 million, is going to be moved into Taiwan for assets in terms of lending. For the on a military side. So again, these are some key pieces when we look at what is happening, how this continues to be a stress point, and this is not something that is going to slow down. But when you look at China, so Xi has finally replaced 2 people within the military that were kicked out due to the corruption issues. We've also seen some fears around Taiwan. It would take a very large landing force, and and I can assure you there are a lot of satellites, there are a lot of things in the region that are watching this, and it's not something that would happen very quickly. It's not something that would happen very easily, and it is not. We put that as a very low probability for this year and even next year and beyond. So, because I know that some people are really concerned about this. If the Russian invasion of Ukraine went a bit differently, maybe that would increase it. If Russia was able to move in quickly, if you didn't get some additional reunification of NATO, some new NATO areas joining, there could have been something. But I think that there's been a bit of a pause. And realistically, if I was Xi, why go south when you could go north? I mean, and move into some areas that are very rich in some very viable crude. Now, we've seen a lot happening within Niger, within the areas. So political instability continues to expand across this area, which is essentially the crossover between, let's call it a rainforest or, very lush up into the Sahara Desert. And you can see that there's been a lot of pressure points. So Niger has been, there was a coup, there's going back and forth. The ECOWAS, which is backed by many assets, including the U.S., have said that, they're active. The other areas have been suspended. And there's a back and forth in terms of, is there going to be a military conflict? So there is support of the active members to come in and defend the regime that was replaced with the coup. And there is a lot of uncertainty circling around this. Now, this is just, we wanted to present it as a problem. We are going to do a bit more work on it, and we'll talk about some of the different players and how this could play out as things continue to develop, because the U.S. and France are very active in these regions from a military perspective, from a launch perspective. There is crew that cycles within this, and there's a fear that if there is an uncertainty or a coup that creates some additional struggle within this region, It would give ISIS, it would give Boko Haram, another area to grow and expand. And that's why this is an interesting, and it will be a focal point of some foreign policy. Nothing that you'll see in the bigger headlines, but things that'll be happening under the surface, which is why we want to talk about it so much. And we'll layer that back into where is food insecurity, and why are things happening in this region. This is, I think, a really good chart, just looking at the notable Chinese flight incursion, breaking the plane, if you will, of Taiwan. Here you can see, the path that it took. It's happened on an air basis. It's happened on a sea basis. You can see that there's been several points of crossing and breaching. A lot of it is testing. Where are they on the testing side? When was the airplane or ship? When was it flagged? There's a lot of key things when you look at testing barriers. And not to belittle this, but if you remember one of the famous scenes of Jurassic Park, when the dinosaurs essentially testing to see if the lines are actually electrified. It happens all the time. That's why when you hear about the NYPD or someone finding a suitcase or a bag, it is a thing, because terrorists and people will test what is the response time, how quickly, what if I dropped it here instead of there, and they run these drills, and this is just one of them, of testing their defenses, testing their ability to find and alert. And again, it also shows you where do they respond from, what region. So again, there's a lot of information that can be gathered when you're testing the defenses and these barriers. So that's one of the reasons why, when you look at the geopolitical and banking risks that remain prominent, it's no surprise when you look at the latest global risk survey, you've seen an increase in stagflation, which I think is very, very common. And then the credit supply, as we've seen with the U.S., that was just recently downgraded. What does that mean? How is that going to impact things? And geopolitical tensions, and this is, continuing it came back a little bit, but don't sleep on that. Like, it's still over 60% of the issue. And as this food issue and these uncertainties continue to rise, so will the likelihood of that political stress. So when you look at the number, this is from 2020, and so we're going to look at 2020 and how things have progressed, because we do have data from 21 and 22. But unfortunately, as we know, it didn't get any better in 23. So back in 2020, we saw that 418 million people that live in Asia are under starvation, 282 million in Africa, 60 million in Latin America and the Caribbean, and about just over 3 billion are deemed what are malnourished, which is a calorically insufficient diet. And that's something that has only gotten stressed with what has happened with Ukraine and Russia, what has happened with rice coming out of India, what is happening with just wheat prices and prices in general in terms of yield insufficiency, and why, this is one of the key reasons why C6 is looking to invest in stuff that can address these yield shortfalls. I find these opportunities. Celtec is just a perfect example of a fertilizer that increases yield at a much lower cost while being sustainable, renewable, eco-friendly, organic, all of those kitschy little terms. But it really drives home and trying to address a lot of these hunger problems. And this just puts it into perspective of what is moderate and severe. Now, there's always fluctuation of the severe versus moderate. There's a 5-stage scale, which we're going to go through in a minute. But you can kind of see how this is impacting some of the different pieces. And moderate and severe food insecurity has been climbing slowly for 6 years. And again, that's what we like to talk about and what we keep trying to show. It's not just COVID that caused this. This has been something that has been progressing for over 5 years now. We're on year 6, and it has only gotten worse through year 7, 8, and 9. So this isn't something where we say, oh, well, COVID caused this and COVID is gone, so therefore it will be fixed. No, that we need to get serious on addressing this, and we need investments in these areas to really come after and try to find a way to meaningfully increase regional capacity, trying to create more fertility within non-arable land or arable land that has continued to see topsoil degradation, soil health, soil improvement. And this is one of the, again, we can't stress enough the importance of trying to address these pieces. Then now when we start looking at some of the pretty graphics and the data points, here you can see the number of people in GRFC countries, territories facing acute food insecurity, total population of it. When you look at some of the different stress points, it's important to look at the trend that we've been at. And since 2018, you've seen that steady increase over time. And as you get into 2022, now we're at 58 countries. When you look at phase 1 and 2, it's unfortunate because typically once you're into phase 2, the pivot into phase 3 is actually fairly quickly. And it's more because of the stresses that we're seeing on the monetary side, but also on the weather side that is impacting underlying yields. Because we're seeing in China, you're getting these massive storms. You're looking in other areas where you're getting way more wind and rain at the same time, which is blowing down crops, which is damaging crops. And then on other sides, you're not getting enough rain and you're seeing drought and you're seeing yield impacts. So the primary drivers of these acute food insecurities in countries with food crises, it's not surprising to see 27 of those countries due to economic shocks. And unfortunately, with inflation where it is, with the yield shortfalls driving up food prices again, we're not seeing that adjust anytime soon. So it's not. So when you look at Nigeria, Yemen, Myanmar, Syria, Sudan, Ukraine, Pakistan, you're seeing that expansion. And you're seeing that shift when you look at that 43% in Pakistan is moving in that direction. And when you look at phases 4 and 3, unfortunately, when you look at some of these areas, you're getting a much bigger pivot and more of the country is falling under that phase 3 tightness. And because of the cost that it is for food in the global market, you're seeing it very difficult to close that gap. So again, when you just again piecing this all back together and looking at it slightly differently, the number of those people in the territories facing acute food insecurity, we thought that this was a very good, because again, this is looking holistically. You can see that phase 3, and we want to hone in on phase 3 because that phase 4, phase 5 is going to bounce back and forth. But when you look at phase 3 in 2016, 47 million was there. Now you're looking at 43 million. It has not improved in 2023. And when you look at that stress point, and people like to push back on me when I talk about yields. It's like, oh, well, global yields are rising. It's like, but you have to look at the full supply chain of food. You have to look at where is fish, where is beef, where is chicken, where is pig, where pork, where is beans and yield and vegetables and fruits, and how, because if you can't get one, you'll replace it with another until you can't get that one. Then you'll keep sliding scale until you can find something that's affordable. So I think phase 3 really kind of picks up on just how precipitous this crisis is. Now, phase 4 has obviously increased. It's come down a bit from 2021, because we did get some movements, but a lot of that has gotten worse in 2023 with the shifts in the Black Sea grain deal, with the shifts that we've seen in terms of the with some of the other pieces, especially on the rice side, because remember, over 3 billion people rely on rice. And without rice, you're going to see this number go up very quickly. And now you may not hit a catastrophe level, but again, that's going to see that expansion of that phase 3, phase 4 level. Number of people in the IPCCH phase 2. You can see just, again, looking at phase 2, how are things progressing? Phase 2, you're seeing 2016, 87 million. Now in 2022, 253 million. Obviously, the phase 3 had that 47 to 143, but when you look at that phase 2, that pivot and that crossover into phase 3, into that crisis point, only increases and gets much worse. And that's why we continue to talk about this is going to be a big driving force when you look at what is going to happen on an economic basis, especially because the global economy is not going to meaningfully improve in 2024. We still have inflation as a problem. We still have stagflation. We still have pressure. Now you have credit going up. I mean, with the U.S. downgrade, the 10-year a U.S. bond has gone well over 4%, and the 10-year is the bellwether that is used to lend to emerging markets, the frontier markets, developing markets. So that's only going to increase the struggle and the pain in which that they're going to get financing. And then one of the things that we've also talked about is the UN food program, or the World Economic food program is running short on money. Now, that's twofold. Have they gotten less financing? Yes. But there's also more and more people that are on that program. So not only are they getting less money because other developed markets are struggling, but the cost of, or the length that their money that is in the coffers can go is now smaller as crop prices have gone up. And you have more countries that want it. So you have less funding, more expensive, more demand. So again, this is where we're seeing the stress point. And we want to hone in on this key area when you look at the pressure points in the share of analyzed populations by phase of acute food insecurity. So when you start looking at the different regions, you get an idea of, well, if people are well fed, if people feel good about where things are going, the direction, they're likely not going to be as anxious. But when you start seeing people that are unable to eat, when you start to see your family struggling, as someone who has children, if you hear your 3-year-old, 4-year-old crying because they're hungry and you physically can't feed them, I mean, that's gut-wrenching. You'll do anything for your children. And when you're looking at a distended stomach from malnutrition, when you're looking at these pressure points, you're gonna get, it'll make you angry. You will do something to change the scenario, to change the situation. And when you look at Niger, when you look at that stress into that crisis level, that's where we've seen that continuation. You've seen more and more people go from stressed to crisis. You're seeing that pressure point. You're seeing that, and which is going to incentivize people. Now, typically, you've gotten a lot of support that has come from Russia on this, that has come from Ukraine, as well as the U.S. and Europe. But cereal production forecasts fall to the lowest since 2007 when you look at EU production. So again, where are we going to source these volumes to supplement, to try to drive this? Because realistically, everybody will feed themselves first. So the countries are going to make sure that their people are fed, export the excess. The UN World Food Program is in the midst of a crippling funding crisis that is forcing to scale back of life-saving assistance. And as that assistance drains, you will get more and more geopolitical uncertainty, more instability, because people are going to drive for ways to do that. And at least 38 of 86 WFP country operations already have seen cuts or planned cuts because, half of WFP grain in 2022 came from Ukraine. So the collapse of the Black Sea grain deal, we can't stress enough on when you look at Russia, and you can say a lot of things about Putin. He is not a stupid man. He may be crazy. He may be an individual who is not trusting and has moved away from his advisors, but he's calculating. So how do you go after developed markets? How do you make developed markets look worse? Well, let's take away some of the grain that they were using and try to address the way people view those countries. So what do? You take it away. You cut, and then what Russia has come out and said is, they'll provide it. Don't worry about the Ukraine. Don't worry about the UN World Food Program. We'll do it for you. Now, again, we think that's a lie, or at least they'll try to do what they can. But this is that game. This is that how do you promote your view of the world? Now they've been saying, and Russia's been saying, that there's more and more of a opportunity for Russia. Africa views Russia differently, and when you go do some of the other analysis, there's still a lot of questions in terms of Russia, but Niger has called on Wagner. So again, you're looking at Russia, Wagner, the interlocking with Russia trying to create almost a new proxy war. We've seen it in Syria. Now we're in Ukraine. Not that Ukraine is a proxy war because Russia is directly involved, but now you're seeing this expansion into West Africa, Central Africa. This is a big move that we really want to track on, and it all can still boil down to and come down to where is food. If you provide food, you provide power, and if you get that power, then you can obviously force your will. So when you look at the world's biggest exporters of rice, just to again rehash where things are, India's 22.5 million tons in 2022 of non-basmati white rice, which accounted for 45% of India's rice exports. So if 22.5 million, essentially half of it is non-basmati. Then you look at other areas. Well, you look at Vietnam. Vietnam so far is okay, but Thailand, I said Vietnam earlier, it was Thailand. Thailand urges farmers to reduce their rice plantings to save water following poor rainfall, and a move that poses a fresh threat to the global supply after India already banned it, which is why you're seeing a large jump in what is a staple product for many in the region. Thailand has urged farmers to reduce their rice plantings to save water following the plant with poor rainfall. Farmers in the key central region have already planted most of their rice, but the government is encouraging a switch to other crops that need less water. And that's, again, just another stress point when you look at that African point. And it's not just food. It's when you look at other parts of the economy, the JP Morgan Global Manufacturing PMI, S&P Global's gauge of worldwide manufacturing activity hit 48.7, matching the lowest level since June 2020, with sub-indices of factory output and new orders both slipping to 6-month lows. Remember, new orders is a leading indicator for where things are going to progress. When you look at what is the driver, India continues to be strong. We actually don't see that changing in the near term. But when you look at China, China has slipped further. When you look at the U.S., when you look at Europe, you continue to see this weakness. And if Europe, U.S., U.K., France, Italy, when you're not seeing them purchase, when you see them slowing, again, that's going to bleed down and impact those emerging markets even further. Now, when you look at the ASEAN manufacturing sector, it came in at 50.8, so it did show some growth. But again, in June, it was 51. So business confidence fell to a 3-year low, and that's where we continue to see that pressure. Vietnam is coming back up. It's still negative, but you can see that is really where we're seeing most of that benefit. And then Indonesia continues to be a bit of that bright spot as a lot of the others continue to fall further into contraction or cross over. But again, you're seeing that slowdown, that impact that is going to continue. We've already seen South Korea, Taiwan, already see that meaningful drop in imports, which again shows that drop or that future drop that's coming in exports, which is why we're going to see more of those pressure points and the food inflation hotspots. It's no surprise to see a lot of that hitting in Africa, in that Central Asia component that continues to get worse. Domestic food price inflation remains high, and obviously where you would consider Venezuela, Lebanon, Zimbabwe, Argentina, Suriname. The most recently available monthly data, 63.2% of low-income economies are at above 5%. It was previously 61. 79.5% of lower middle-income countries, that was initially 79.1. Upper middle income, slightly better. High income, the same. So again, in real terms, food price inflation exceeded overall inflation in 80.1%, which is, again, from 166 countries. So 80% of 166 countries saw food inflation exceed overall inflation, which again, I can't stress enough the amount of pressure that puts on the market and the economy. And the emerging market inflation is back to central bank targets. But again, even if it's back to their targets, what does that core look like? And that's where we continue to see that stickiness in core and those pressure points. But remember, people want better living conditions. And it was interesting because the projected number of ACs in the US globally, and you might think, why are we talking about ACs? Well, air conditioning takes a significant amount of power. And as people want, the comforts of the world as we know it, they're going to demand the same comforts that developed markets have. And it's not something that's going to go away, but we have to find a way to meaningfully address this on just looking at just that electricity demand and those electrons, which is why on a C6 level, we're investing in baseload power. We need more baseload power. There is a huge advantage to going after this and really addressing a lot of these underlying problems. Now, when we look at history, this is, I thought, a really cool chart in terms of looking the first 2 years of inflation can be seen as transitory, but then the next 20 years isn't transitory. And it's interesting because they're taking 20 years, but we don't have to go as far out. Because when you look at the level of stimulus that we've had, it's important to look at, okay, well, you've had stimulus realistically since 2008. So let's just call it for the last 15 years. You've had broad stimulus that has never really gone the other way. And we've seen inflation exceed that 8%. So when you've seen it hit that 8%, there's always this view that it's like raise rates, get in front of it. But then you create a problem, and a lot of this, as we've talked about with the 70s and the pressure that has come in with that market, is that you can't cut too soon. Central banks can't cut too soon because then you re-accelerate it, and then you create this problem. And this is something that you can say a lot about Jay Powell or Jeremy Powell, but he's not stupid, and he's looking at what has happened in the past. And again, this is just showing us that the last thing he's going to want to do is cut too soon. And that has been in my opinion, one of the biggest drivers of why inflation wasn't transitory when you look out in a further time, because they cut too soon. And that then re-accelerated and created a much bigger problem, bigger bubble, especially with what we're seeing in power prices, with what we're seeing in gasoline and diesel prices, what we're seeing in food prices. They need to get in front of this to try to bring a lot of this down. Now, obviously, there's that supply-demand economics, but they ignored it in the 70s, and look at what happened. And that's why they're trying to get in front of this. But we've talked a lot about the issues in emerging markets and frontier markets. Well, the U.S. is no different. Low-income households have pulled back on grocery spending when you look at where things are. And just it's interesting when you look at how that has shifted overall. You've seen a bit of an increase in spending as 50K and higher have tried to address the increase in inflation. But the lower income hasn't been able to do that, and food insecurity is highest among low earners and households with children. For anybody who has a child, you can understand why, because they eat a lot. They're little bottomless pits, and a lot of times they won't like what you make. But all kidding aside, it's just you have more mouths to feed, and it's becoming harder and harder to feed those individuals, not only because prices have gone up, but shrinkflation. Something may look like it's the same price, but it's less weight. So again, that means less weight, less volume to feed people. So you have to go out now, instead of buying one box, you're buying 2 boxes. Instead of buying 2 boxes, it's 3. And you can see how that can continue to compound, which is why nearly half of low-income consumers reported receiving SNAP benefits, which again are food stamps. When you look at it, we've gone from in January of 22, we were at just over 40%, and now we are at about 48% and rising. And given what we've just discussed on a global basis, this is not going to improve, especially as when you look at the year-over-year change in the S&P 500 and the ISM manufacturing PMI. Well, the manufacturing PMI is not getting much better, and the service PMI is losing steam. So I don't know what people in the equity world are looking at, but this is going to be an important thing to watch as you get a lot of these stress points continue to increase. So that's what we have for you here. In the next segment, we're going to go a bit deeper into what is happening in the U.S. We're going to just start back just one slide to make sure that, and really connect all of this, because this is all very much U.S. based as well. We just wanted to also show how we've talked so much about emerging markets, frontier markets, but it's worse everywhere. And we wanted to really tie that in.